What's good? It's Woog. Jake Paul just defeated Anderson Silva via unanimous decision. So it happened. The Jake Paul Express continues and the beat goes on. I thought that this was a major threshold for the Jake Paul experiment. It was one thing to see him beat Ben Askren, even Tyron Woodley, who was a former UFC welterweight champion. That's 170, still smaller than Jake Paul. But Tyron Woodley also had pretty good hands, wrestling background, but he had explosive punching power and speed in the UFC. So it was one thing to see Jake Paul kind of incrementally work his way up opponent quality wise. It is another thing to see him now fight somebody his own size, albeit a 47, 48-year-old Anderson the Spider Silva, who, in my view is the greatest mixed martial arts striker of all time. And obviously well past his prime, but this was going to answer a lot of questions about Jake Paul. And one, this is the biggest and the most meaningful sample size that we have of Jake Paul's abilities. You can only gain so much from the little bit of time he spent in the ring with Nate Robinson and Ben Askren, even though the Tyron Woodley first fight went the 8-round distance, and Jake Paul did get hit and rocked in the middle rounds and battled back and earned the the decision win by winning a couple of those last rounds against Tyron Woodley in the first fight. Obviously knocked Woodley out cold in the 6th round of their rematch. Woodley was a late replacement for Tommy Fury, but Jake Paul, in the first half of that fight against Woodley in the rematch, he was looking very basic, very limited. It wasn't very action-packed. He didn't do a ton to assert himself in the first half of the fight, where he's demonstratively winning the rounds, where he's not rocking the opponent. So in this Jake Paul versus Anderson Silva fight, I actually went Anderson Silva via decision. I thought that I had seen him exhibit more, of the well-rounded, sweet science, technical skills, and I couldn't get Anderson Silva outboxing Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. out of my head. And Anderson Silva's a southpaw. He's at least the same height as Jake Paul, and plus he just has a ton of championship level fighting experience, albeit it's not boxing experience. Anderson Silva had a few boxing fights, but not a meaningful boxing career. So in Jake Paul versus Anderson Silva, this gave us the biggest evidence on how we should assess Jake Paul. And I've got to say, I was pretty damn impressed. So the judges had it basically 6 rounds to 2, 6 rounds to 2, 5 rounds to 3. One judge had it 5 to 3, the other had it 6 to 2, and you've got to include the knockdown for Jake Paul in the 8th round. He dropped Silva with an overhand right hand. And, I thought that Jake Paul had more or less a puncher's chance in this one. I thought that Anderson Silva would be able to outbox Jake Paul in the rounds where Jake Paul didn't do something to meaningfully hurt Anderson Silva. So it's basically Jake Paul either dropping Silva or hurting Silva, or Anderson Silva winning the round on the card. That's the way that I kind of saw this one playing out. But no, Jake Paul has improved. He's improved his jab to the body. Now, he was jabbing to the body even against Ben Askren to set up the big right hand up top. But in this fight, he did a lot more feints, like a lot more meaningful feints that either drew a reaction out of Silva, or at least drew Silva's hands up, or getting some sort of like a, let me either move or move my head, something to gain something out of Silva movement-wise to where you could then put something on top. Now, did Jake Paul always put something on top of the feint? No. But, he did enough feinting to where the movement of Silva wasn't an issue where it was throwing Jake Paul off rhythm. I thought that, yes, Silva showed some good movement, especially in the first half of the fight. He demonstratively slowed down in the second half of the fight, which was a lot of people's concern for the nearly 50-year-old Anderson Silva, was that, in the second half of the fight, is he going to be as nimble? Are his reflexes going to be as good? Is he going to be as explosive in being able to throw, not only 1 to 2 shots at a time to maybe hurt Jake, but to put enough volume together to where you could win the rounds, right? Win the rounds where there's nothing major going on. Silva's activity, his output dropped considerably in the second half. And even in the first half of the fight, I thought that, for instance, he threw barely any punches in the first round. But like the 1 or 2 punches that Silva threw landed. Like he landed a big left hand in the first round, but threw almost nothing else. But in the, in rounds 2 through 6, I thought he fought a lot more in a spirited way, to where you could give Silva, 2 or 3 of those rounds 2 through 6 rounds. So that's where Silva was at his livest. And then 7 and 8, his activity dropped off. He started getting beaten up noticeably by Jake Paul. And again, in the last round, he got dropped by Jake Paul. And another thing that we learned about Jake Paul, in my opinion, is that Jake Paul has a chin. Like, Jake Paul can take punches and not look like he's not a fighter. He could take punches like a pro. Now, where you would rate him, amongst professionals, we still haven't seen him fight a bona fide professional. We've seen him fight a couple guys who've had a couple professional fights. Silva has had a few, but we haven't seen him fight, somebody who's dedicated their life and career to being a boxer, more or less, right? But Jake Paul can take a punch. He got landed on flush a few times by Silva, but I thought that, he took the punches well. I thought that he showed some pretty good defense. Like, he keeps his shoulders up. Even if his hands aren't up, his shoulders are up. And he's, moving his head enough to where he's not just a stationary target. Now, he doesn't have like the same flashy type of reflex-based head movement that Anderson Silva, for instance, has when he's at his best and at his freshest. But Jake Paul does have pretty decent defense. And again, they're not as big lulls in between of the big punches as there were in prior fights. He's just a lot more active. He's throwing jabs to the body, right hands to the body, jabs up top. He's throwing more hooks. He's throwing more combinations, and he's doing more to get inside of range. He's tying up and putting his body on the opponent. Like, I saw him tie Silva up and to just kind of move Silva around. Now, Silva did his share of moving Jake around physically as well, but I thought that Jake was more physical, which you want to be, especially against an older, much older opponent. But yeah, Jake Paul is showing considerable improvements, in my opinion. Like, this was a big deal. A lot of people might just scoff at it, roll their eyes, but Dana White was basically daring Jake Paul to fight Anderson Silva. He's like, you can fight Silva if you want to, like, kind of tongue-in-cheek, wink, wink, good luck, And Jake Paul has just beaten Anderson Silva, and it's not a controversial decision. Nothing about this looked like a fix. You could argue that Jake Paul and his handlers have had some very favorable matchmaking where they're, picking a 47, 48-year-old Anderson Silva, but the odds were competitive here. And a lot of people, including myself, I picked Anderson Silva to win this one via decision. Was that naivety on my part? Was I in denial? Was I just not ready to see Jake Paul beat one of the two, in my opinion, one of the two, you could say maybe top 3, but I've got him top 2 greatest mixed martial artists of all time? To see Jake Paul beat him up? Maybe I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I had a little bit too much faith in the nearly 50-year-old Anderson Silva. But no, Jake Paul should be applauded for this victory. And we'll see how he match makes next, whether it is Tommy Fury or Nate Diaz. We'll see how the Jake Paul Express continues going forward, but I was impressed by him. I was looking at him, and again, yes, it is an old fighter he was up against, but Jake Paul looked like he was showing, professional grade skills. Not to mention that this is an 8-rounder. This wasn't a 4-rounder, wasn't a 6-rounder. And yes, Jake Paul's last few fights have been scheduled for 8 rounds. But we just saw, again, Jake Paul outlast and beat up Anderson Silva and go the full 8 rounds, fight a good 8 rounds, and come away with the decision. Hats off to Jake Paul. Again, I don't know where we go from here, but this was a significant step. And it was against somebody his own size. So, Yeah, Jake Paul, and yes, that right hand is for real. Like, we just saw him drop Anderson Silva with it. It's one thing to drop smaller guys like Askren, Woodley, and so forth. It's another thing when you drop Anderson the Spider Silva. You know, Chavez Jr. had 8 rounds to do the same thing to Silva, to drop him, and Chavez Jr. lost on the cards. And granted, Chavez Jr. was a former middleweight champion who doesn't seem to be taking much seriously in the way of preparation and professionalism. But yeah, I don't want to take anything away from Jake Paul in this. You know, for me, unexpected. Maybe y'all expected it. A lot of people thought Jake Paul might score the knockout here, and that was very possible as well, given Jake Paul's power. But yeah, we see that he's got a bit of durability. He's got consistently improving skills, and he's got a chin. He's got some cardio, some endurance. I don't know if he beats Anderson Silva if it's the same Jake Paul that entered the ring against Tyron Woodley in the rematch. But yeah, I think we're getting a better version of Jake Paul just about every time he enters the ring. But yeah, let me know your thoughts about Jake Paul versus Anderson Silva in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.